In the last 4 years, we have given you thousands of tips to help instantly climb the ranks in Valorant. And today is no different. I am going to be collaborating with 3 professional coaches in Radiant and Immortal to bring you 100 game-changing Valorant tips that every player needs to know. No matter where you are in your Valorant journey, this video will have countless tips that will instantly transform your gameplay. So without further ado, let's get right into the video, starting with our very first tip. With anything in life, Valorant included, you should be very okay with the idea of being wrong. This is especially important in Valorant because every time that you do something stupid, you're probably going to get called out by a teammate in a not so nice way. Now, don't get me wrong, you shouldn't ever just blindly trust your teammates in ranked. There's a high likelihood anything your teammates tell you in ranked is just completely incorrect, especially if you are in the lower ranks. However, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't think about it. I'm someone who gets pretty defensive when called out. However, something I always do when I'm accused of being wrong is after the fact, I will think about the situation and come to my own conclusions. There's been plenty of times I've been called out by a player for making a mistake, thought about it afterwards, and determined that there was some truth in what they were saying. That being said, I've been playing a lot of League of Legends lately, and I'm currently Gold 1. So I just want to try to relate to a bunch of lower elo players here for the moment. Why is it that every single Gold player seems to genuinely believe that they are good at the game? I will be harassed for an entire match because of one perceived mistake that I made in a game, but at the end of the day, we are all Gold. Nobody here is going pro. It's not like we're pushing the envelope when it comes to skill in League of Legends. Can we please have a little bit of humility and just accept that we have a lot to learn? Anyway, though, I digress. Tip number 1, never stop learning. Tip number 2 may get some pushback from players, but if I could go back to day 1, I'd pretty much only pick Jett for my first 1,000 hours of play. That's a lot of time, so let me talk about that a bit more. The reason for this is that duelists are encouraged to take duels, and agents with dismiss abilities like Jett Stash inspire confidence because you literally have a get out of jail free card. Now, there is a problem with this as well. Having a get out of jail free card often encourages bad habits because you don't really need to think about what fights you're going to take. You can just get away with swinging anything. This is why you'll see so many stupid duelist players who really don't know how the game works. They just don't get punished for making mistakes. We'll talk about that more in tip number 3, but can I just be real with you guys for a second? I've brought this up on Twitter before, but the other reason I recommend playing duelist just has to do with how vile the community is at times. You see, by nature in Valorant, duelists will get more kills, which is fine on the surface. That's just how the game works. Initiators are meant to use their utility to help duelists get kills, and duelists are meant to use their utility to help duelists get kills. This doesn't mean an agent like Jett doesn't serve any purpose to a team, but a Sova recon can help everyone, while a Jett dash only really helps Jett help her team. It's a selfish role, and because of this, duelists on average have higher KDAs than support players. This is a real stat, you can look it up. But who is the first person that you blame on your team when you start losing? Normally it's the bottom frag. By playing duelists, you will bottom frag less, meaning you won't be the target of just blatant harassment in your matches due to how many kills you have. Not only that, but you'll probably just have more fun because you'll get more kills. Have you ever tried playing an agent like Breach without any teamwork? It kinda sucks. Every time I'm on a no-comm team playing Initiator, I'm wondering why I didn't just pick Yoru and play for myself. It really disappoints me that my point of view has shifted this much because I love playing a supportive role for my team. But if I went back in time and wanted to improve faster while having the most fun in matchmaking, I would probably just be a Jett main from the start. Let's talk about tip number 3 though, which is another main part of this. Aim is the most important thing in Valorant. These tips go together because it's really hard to build up good aim and confidence if you don't take fights. Playing duelist rewards taking fights, and taking more fights will make you better at taking fights. Make sense? This has become more and more obvious the higher rank that I get. The unfortunate thing about Valorant is that in matchmaking, there's not really a lot of strategy involved. This isn't to say that there aren't things you can do to make life significantly easier. However, if there is a clear aim difference between you and your opponents, more often than not, the team with the better aim is the one that will win. They can just do whatever they want and get away with it. It's like playing Monopoly with somebody who just keeps stealing money from the bank every time they need it. You can't beat them. They're literally robbing the bank. As we mentioned earlier, these duelist players will swing everything, which isn't very smart. However, if you can't punish them for swinging everything, they will get infinite value out of it, hence robbing the bank. They'll get tons of info, tons of space, and tons of kills from it. You need to be able to go toe-to-toe with these players, otherwise you will never be able to punish their mistakes and will always lose to them. That's why our Aim God course is designed to teach you everything that you need to know about aiming so that you can skip the part where you look like this and get to the part where you look like this. The thing is, it's not that difficult to actually get elite level level aim, you just need to know the fundamentals and how to apply them. According to our studies, on average, it takes players over 1,000 ranked games before they ever hit Diamond. That's nearly 700 hours of playtime. You could climb on your own, but you're never going to get that time back. With SkillCapped, we could cut that in half for you. Instead, you'll skip through the learning stages as fast as possible and start climbing tomorrow. And the best part is, if you don't climb while using our service, we'll literally just give you your money back. So if you're feeling hard stuck, or maybe you just don't want to waste your time in Elo Hell, check out SkillCapped using that link below for a discount, and we will see you there. Moving on to tip number 4, probably one of the most basic habits that you could have that most players still don't apply. If you see 5 players on the map at any point in time, you know that they have given up all map control on the other side of the map. You should instantly look to take that space the moment you locate all 5 players and know that it's safe. Especially as a defender, don't just rotate through spawn, go straight through mid and take all of the free space the attackers had given up. This is part of your fundamentals. It's just something you should do when you see 5 players. That will rarely be a bad decision. So in our last video, I talked about how Valorant is a game that is meant to be perfected. Think about same maps, same angles, same agents. At each round's start, the barriers come down and you take the same duels and you just practice this over and over and get better and better each time at taking those fights or pushing those sites. It is a super repetitive game, so it's meant to be perfected. Because of this though, that means that pattern recognition is a massive part of playing Valorant, which is something that I never really mentioned in these videos. The thing is, after you put in thousands of hours into Valorant, everything feels like deja vu. Every day I'm still learning new things, but for the most part, every match feels more or less the same. It's hard to catch me off guard with something that I haven't seen before, and most teams play the exact same way, so much so that it becomes pretty predictable. This is exactly something that we talk about in our recent wall hacks course on our website. At the start of the round, there are standard positions that teams will play and tells for where each player is and how they're going to reposition in the round. When I was really new to the game, I actually reached out to professional coach and analyst Sean Garris to ask him about how players seemingly are able to run teams over in matchmaking so quickly in the round, and this is what he told me. The people in ranked that run it down typically have really good ways to deal with standard setups. What you have to realize is that ranked isn't like a team scrim. When the teams spawn, they play default spots almost always, so they know where fights are and speed up super quickly. It's actually super important that these players are able to frag out quickly in the round too, because based on the timing in the round, there's a lot more options for your opponents. Those standard positions they were in at the start of the round quickly start to have more options. They could have flanked, they could be rotating over, they could still be hanging around. The more time they have, the more variance in their play. That's exactly what our course aims to teach you though. We'll show you all of the standard positions on every map and how to abuse them. This is essential if you want to hard carry your matches, so we highly recommend checking it out. This next tip is crucial though, so listen up. You need to know when the most important thing for you to do is stay alive. There are going to be times in Valorant when you are in such a good position that literally you just staying alive is more important than landing any kills. If you are flanking and have 5 players contained in one area, you need to just play a rat angle to guarantee that you're not going to die for free. If you're holding a significant amount of map control and die, the floodgates are going to be opened and your opponents can go anywhere. Remember, your goal is to contain, not to kill. Too often, players just don't know their value of staying alive. Your life is so important, and the moment that you die, you lose all impact in the round. So you need to be sure that you get enough value while you're alive to put your team in a position to win before you end up dying. There are ways to have value even after you die though. For number 7, plainly put, communication is the easiest way to get consistent value. Some days you just won't be able to aim, but you can always have good communication, so it's something that you should strive for in every single match. I don't know about you guys, but I'm so tired of seeing bottom frag arena players who don't say a word. Almost worse than them not speaking actually is them complaining and apologizing the whole game about not being able to aim today. There's a stigma surrounding Reyna that she just can only be useful when getting kills, which is partly true due to her toolkit, but you can still have a massive impact even as a bottom frag Reyna if you just help your team take space and communicate effectively. Literally just run in, throw your leers, get traded, and talk to your teammates. That's all that we ask. I will never be mad at a player for having a bad aim day, but if you ignore us the whole match and don't say a single word, yeah, I'm going to never want to play with you again. Ironically, I actually feel like my round win rate goes up when I die early enough in the round to guide my teammates because I'm able to think more clearly. I will be able to quickly see all the mistakes that my teammates are making and guide them to a more successful retake or post plans. I see that my Omen has blind available and that we have smokes and my Reyna has a Leer and then my Sova has a recon, and I'm like wondering why is nobody calling this stuff out. Sometimes when I die, it's like I start playing a verbal purple RTS to guide my teammates on a retake. I'm just guiding all of my units into the bomb site so that we can win. Some of you might think that this is backseating, but this actually brings up tip number 8, which is good comms are not backseating. When your team is setting up for a retake, they need to be talking to each other. That is how the game works. If I see my team approaching a retake and my Omen isn't telling anyone that he has blind and how he wants to use it, that is an issue. If my teammates are in a 2v1 and they're not communicating how they're going to play it, that's a problem. You need to get good at reading your teammates and calling out the things that they're too bad to call out themselves. It's not even just that though. Oftentimes if you're dialed in, you're just not going to be able to make these comms in the moment. If Demon 1 is fighting 5 players at once, ducking in and out of cover, he doesn't want to have to key up to scream, "Help me!" The man is focused. Someone else can easily see that he needs help and call for a flash or a flood or a smoke or something to help this man out. Do be mindful if you see 2 players in a clutch, they might be talking in Discord if they're duoed, but oftentimes you can tell if they're communicating just by how they play it. Too many players are afraid of talking while they're dead because it will be viewed as backseating. But if you're saying things that are actually helpful, it's not backseating and nobody is going to yell at you. I talk a lot when I'm dead, and not once have I ever been yelled at for backseating. And you know what? On the occasion that I do catch myself talking when I shouldn't, I just apologize because just like for tip number 1, sometimes you mess up. Moving on, tip number 9 is the secret to getting insane aim in Valorant. It's something that can easily take your aim from 0 to 100 in the shortest amount of time possible. If I could go back to when I first started playing Valorant, I'd make sure that I committed to aim training every single day for 30 minutes a day. I've done aim training before, but I pretty much have always let my routine slip through at one point or another. Whether that was a month or a week, it didn't matter, but every single time I started aim training, I immediately started to notice the benefits in my aim. It's something that can never hurt your aim, so even if it's something that you don't necessarily believe in, if you have the time, I recommend that you try it. And don't stop. Just because you hit Immortal doesn't mean your aim can't get better. In fact, I would argue that this is where you need it the most. Getting that extra 1% of rank is one of the most difficult things to do. In one of our recent studies that we ran on the channel, we found that the average Radiant player had nearly double the amount of playtime of Ascendant and Immortal players. Nearly double. That is absolutely insane. Remember, the best part to start aim training was 10 years ago, but the second best time is now. For tip number 10, I wanted to talk about the best information gathering tool in the game that literally every single agent has. And that's your ears. Yay, woo! No, but really, you can gather so much information at the start of the round by just standing in good spots. Especially in low elo, players just run everywhere that they go, so you can gather tons of information by literally just listening. On every map, there's different locations where you can stand to immediately listen for enemies at the start of the round. If you're playing an agent like Sova, oftentimes this means that you don't need to recon for info. You can just save it for when they run in because you will already hear them at the start of the round anyway. For example, I like to stand next to the spawn barrier on C Long Haven because I can listen for info from both outside of Garage as well as C Long. You'll hear right away if the attackers are pushing C, and if you don't hear anything, most of the time you can actually just walk up and take the space for free. This is really good for duelists for playing C because this is generally going to provide your team a ton of value if you're able to take this space. Or from B Heaven on Split, you can hear Market and B Main. It's literally free info, so take advantage of it. Normally you'll realize the offense doesn't make any attempt to mask their movements, and you can just decide in the first 4 seconds of the round if they're going to hit site or not. It sounds like a small trick because it is, but trust me, this stuff is overpowered in ranked. Give it a shot. Tip number 11 is something that I came around to recently, but have you ever thought about how each map is meant to be played? Everyone recognizes that the maps are different, obviously, but what makes them different? And how do pro teams take advantage of each map to gain an advantage in the game? I used to think none of this made that big of a deal in matchmaking because nobody is playing the game properly anyway, but this makes it so if you just move around the map in the correct ways, it actually provides a massive amount of pressure. So for example, on a map like Split, most of the time your controller is going to smoke vents because this is what feels natural. By smoking vents, you could scale up mid safely and then pressure into B Heaven. But the issue with this is that smoking vents doesn't ever really deal with the issue of a player in vents. This player at any point in time could swing out of the smoke and eliminate your team, and if you guys try to push B Heaven, that will probably happen. However, if you smoke stairs, it's actually much better. This way you can keep all of your gunfights in front of you, and you could force the vents player to fall back into A Heaven, separating the defense and giving your team a massive advantage in the round. Or for example, on Haven, A lobby and short are pretty important areas to control. The goal for defense is normally to get a jet posted up in A lobby so that they can rotate players off of A to stack other parts of the map. The goal for offense is to deny the defenders this space and try to insert a player in short so that they can listen for rotates and potentially get a lurk off later in the round. However, most teams just completely misplay this map and will try to force their way into A immediately at the start of the round. You don't need to book it into sight everywhere that you go. It's okay to play the map. Once you take a short control, go back and re-clear mid and then feel out the round. Decide where you want to go later. We currently have courses for how to abuse Bind, Ascent, and Lotus on our website if you're looking for cheat codes on those maps as well, but basically figure out how the maps work and just try your best to make decisions in line with that philosophy. Most often, it will pay off. This is also important to keep in mind because of tip number 12. Your teammates don't know what they're doing. This is important to recognize because they're going to often say things that don't make any sense. You'll be playing on Ascent and your teammates will just keep rushing it down B or A every single round, completely ignoring the middle of the map. And if you watch our Ascent course, you'll know that the middle of the map is pretty important. Or on your first full buy round, your team will just want to spread out and wander around solo, losing their gunfights. They'll pop a surrender vote at 0-4 and try to force up after losing the pistol every time. Sure, there's something to be said about working with your teammates and how it's better to make the wrong decisions together than the right decision alone. Except that's not always true. You need to learn the fundamentals and then practice them in game. Your teammates likely don't even know what the fundamentals are, so you need to guide them. They'll try to constantly call bad strats, so it's your job to steer them in the right direction. For what it's worth, by the way, your opponents don't know what they're doing either. In this regard, people will often say disrespect your opponents until they earn your respect. Basically, just because something is technically the wrong decision, if it's working and you're getting value out of it, go for it. If your opponents don't know how to punish it, that's their problem. Take the free win. Speaking of punishing mistakes, it's a lot easier to do if you know how each agent works. We're under the belief that it's best to just try to play 1 or 2 agents while climbing, just so that you can really build up agent mastery. But we've heard players say things like, I can't play smokes countless times, and this is actually a massive issue. By knowing how each agent is played, you can better coordinate with your teammates and make plays that you know are possible due to the agent knowledge that you have. If I play a lot of breach and I try to pick up jet, the moment I have a breach on my team, I'm going to start calling for all of the breach utility that I would normally use. Stun here, flash here. If I play a lot of omen, when I have an omen on my team, I'm going to know where to request blinds from him or call where I want smokes. It's not like you need 100 hours on every agent, but 3 to 4 games in Swift play can be nice that you know how each agent works. I can't tell you how many times I've had teammates ask me when I'm playing Astra to cancel my smokes. It just screams that they have never played Astra in their life. You can't just cancel the smoke at any time. The recall is a completely separate ability. Main 1 or 2 agents, but learn how they all work. It will help you a ton in the long run. Tip number 14 is never back down, never what? Never give up. Don't surrender. This game is based on momentum and you can easily come back from a 3-9 half. One of the biggest complaints about Valorant Pro Play is how teams can run away with the game really quickly with the way the economy functions. You win a pistol round, your opponent is on eco round 2. You win round 2, they buy guns round 3. If you manage to win round 3, they will be on eco again round 4. You win round 4, they'll be on buy round again 5, but if you already are up 4 rounds and really only one of them had a rifle, that's crazy. You're a third of the way to winning the game, and there's only been 1 real gun round. This isn't even factoring in abilities, which can absolutely be game-changing. Valorant matches can snowball so fast. Just don't give up. We want to mention, by the way, that we do understand the struggle in some of these matches. Sometimes you feel like you're playing against a smurf, and they're just completely running over the game. There's a pretty big smurfing problem in Valorant, and playing against a player who is significantly better than you is never fun. I do think there's a really clear misunderstanding in the community, though, with the phrase, you can learn from smurfs, so I wanted to clear that up. For full disclosure, we used to do smurfing content and we don't really anymore. It's not really some moral stance for us. If we felt like we could provide users high value from doing it, we probably would, since at the end of the day, our goal is to help users climb, not to be your best friend. We have a full series showcasing how to carry as controller in low elo, which has gotten fantastic reviews from users on our website. But after we've done it once, it doesn't really make sense to do it again. And I know that half the people listening to this have already tuned out and are immediately having an emotional response to this. But for the other half, just hear me out for a second. When you're playing versus a smurf, they're probably going to win every single gunfight, regardless of what they do. Your goal isn't to learn from the things that they are doing. It's possible they're actually taking really bad gunfights and just getting away with it because they have better aim. The way you want to learn when you're playing against a smurf is developing strategies to beat them. You need to work the problem. Odds are that you won't beat them, but even if you're able to get out 3 or 4 rounds, that's still really cool. People say that you learn the most from playing against players who are better than you, and the reason for that is because players who are better than you will punish you more often for the mistakes that you make. And when you get punished for the mistakes that you make, you're forced to adapt your approach. That's how you get better from playing against smurfs. Don't copy what they're doing, think about what they're doing and how you can punish them for it. More often than not, this is going to be by always fighting them with teammates, which is actually just fundamentally correct anyway. With all the discussion around smurfing, I think it's really important to understand this because it's not a problem that's going away. There's no magical fix for smurfs. Players are always going to cheat the system. And sure, maybe creators stop making smurfing content and the problem diminishes slightly, but you'll always see smurfs in competitive games. I know this isn't fun to hear, but it's just the truth. Keeping this in mind, you have two options. You can either cry about it when you get a smurf in your match and immediately chalk it up as a loss and then complain below YouTube videos. Or you can try your best to adapt, still accepting that the game is probably a loss, but also recognizing it's something out of your power and that you're trying to make the most of the situation. This is also really important because it's not like as you climb, smurfing becomes less of an issue. You'll still get Radiant players absolutely trashing on you in Immortal lobbies all of the time. It's a bit different at this rank because everybody has the ability to aim decently well, but it's still not exactly the most fun thing in the world. The best way to deal with these players is to be a lot more coordinated with your trades and utility. You don't want to give them a chance to take a 1v1 gunfight because you know they're going to win it. So you gather info on their location, and when you locate them, you make sure that any fight that you take, they are sure to get traded out immediately afterwards. Think about it this way. In these pro tournaments that you watch, players don't really miss. If nobody misses, you can't let them have the opportunity to take 1v1 fights because they'll easily mop up 5 1v1s if they are given the chance. You need to use utility and man advantage to find kills at a pro level, otherwise you will just lose. Once you start to avoid giving these players 1v1s, your life will become a lot easier. This isn't the most satisfying solution or thing to hear, but it's the only realistic one that you can apply right now. This next one is a bit harder to grasp for a lot of players though, but for tip 16, when in doubt, double up with a teammate. To keep it simple, the whole game is about trades and number advantage. Whenever possible, you want to take gunfights with teammates, but especially on defense, everyone loves to split up. They have one player cover each choke point, and they nearly never fight together. Instead, try to take advantage of Sentinel utility to cover one choke point so that you can use your teammates to fight the other. Or even just smoke off an entrance. Most of the time, people won't just walk through a smoke without using any form of utility, so you can use that time to group up with a teammate and fight. Especially on maps like Bind, this is essential. Stop trying to hold down a whole push alone. You're just going to get ran over. The next tip works really well with all of the other things we mentioned. Abuse audio circles, flank when there are 5 players on the map. For tip number 17, you'll want to play close to spawn barriers at the start of rounds. The main purpose for this is that you will get immediately involved in the action. Too many times when we're watching low elo replays, we'll see players sitting far back and rotating towards site only to have all of their teammates die and be in a 1v5. Don't get us wrong, there are times where playing next to spawn barriers isn't always the best thing in the world, but just as a general habit, if you're in low elo and struggling to have an impact, this is a great way to put yourself into the action. The next tip is for players who are really looking to climb though. I'm talking to all you tilt queuers out there. I get it. You're winning a lot. You want to keep going. But in situations where you lose 2 games in a row, just stop. Especially if one of the losses was incredibly tilting. Climbing for most players is not a sprint, it is a marathon. Improve bit by bit and make sure each game is as high quality as it can be. Also, have fun. If you're playing more than 3 or 4 games in a session anyway, you're going to start experiencing some fatigue and playing worse. Nobody's playing at the top of their game after hours of playing, so just pace yourself. Play a few games a day, win them, and then stop while you're ahead. Quitting after 2 losses in a row will prevent you from tilt queuing and throwing all of your RR in one day. Number 19 is pretty obvious, but it's also important to remember. It takes a significant amount of playtime to climb in Valorant. You've got to play the game, hands down. There's no solution for that. Each match takes 30 minutes minimum. You're probably going to gain around 20 RR a game, and assuming you're climbing fast, the most that you're going to win is probably around 60% of your games. Not sure if my math checks out here, but this means that for you to climb 100 RR, it will probably take you around 25 matches. I think my math's right there. So that comes out to around 12.5 hours of gameplay just to climb one division. That's not horrible. Keep in mind, sometimes it'll be longer because of loss streaks, or sometimes it will be shorter because of win streaks. You could climb 100 RR in 3 hours if you're stomping every single match, but on average, it's gonna take a bit. We get countless amounts of players in Discord asking why they're so inconsistent, but the reality is they just don't play enough. 55% win rate is climbing pretty handedly. You're doing great. You just gotta keep playing. Finally though, moving towards our last tip, mute players quickly. I mentioned this tip so frequently, I probably mentioned it in the last video. You are not forced to put up with any level of harassment or hate just because you queued into a random lobby with some loser who's going to make you feel bad for your Valorant gameplay. I'm an Immortal and I mute players very quickly for a variety of reasons. I'm not even kidding, sometimes I mute players because I don't like their tone of voice. Just because if somebody is annoying you, you're likely going to play worse. I would much prefer that I can hear myself think than I hear my teammates' mediocre comms. You are not playing with pro players who are going to be communicating effectively anyway. Don't subject yourself to people who are going to make you feel bad just because they might say something useful. You're lying to yourself if you think this is the case. I know it feels true. It's a team game and the idea of not being able to work with your team sounds counterproductive. But the reality is that in matchmaking, your teammates aren't going to be very good and relying on them can actually hold you back. Instead, learn to read your teammates' body language and look at the map often. By looking at the map, you'll pick up on information that your teammates probably won't call out anyways, and by reading your teammates' body language, you can more easily figure out how you can play around them even without comms. This will help make you a better player and in turn just make the game much more enjoyable. Who knows too, maybe if players start getting muted more often for being assholes, they will think again before going off on their teammates.
Now, we know what you're gonna say. Wait a minute. Baiting is bad, but we're here to tell you it's not always bad to bait your teammates. Bait setups are an amazing way to coordinate with your team. By performing a bait setup, you draw the enemy's attention to your teammate and proceed to capitalize on the enemies while their back is turned. Baiting entrying duelists is another form of baiting that's disregarded pretty often. Doing this is pretty simple too. Wait for your duelist to go in and be close to them, but not too close, in order to get an easy trade. Note that this is a great example of proper team play and fully utilizing the purpose of your duelist. Baiting utility is easily one of the most important things you can do in Valorant Ranked. Simply put, baiting utility is creating presence in a commonly contested area of the map. For example, B-site ascent. Once you have presence in that certain area, it'll be very common for the enemy team to utilize Molotovs and even smokes to shut down what they believe is a push from the attacker side. What this is doing effectively is making the enemy team burn through utility that would otherwise be very important for them if you were to actually hit a site on the map. Just remember, one molly from Brim can effectively kill an entire execution on site, so it is best to try and draw these pieces out. Note what utility they've used in that attempt and attempt to hit another area on the map. This segues perfectly into our next tip: performing defaults. Defaults are simple yet very effective when playing against certain types of players. Typically, you want to run defaults into enemies that are more aggressive on defense. The act of defaulting can be confusing for a lot of players though, and a basic rundown of defaulting looks like this. Your team spreads out throughout the map and covers areas the defense side likes to take space in. Generally, after a certain time period, the defenders, if playing aggressive, love to push into areas of the map they believe to be open. From here, your team can capitalize on the defender's mistake and usually find a pick. Just make sure when defaulting that you're giving yourself the advantage in whatever fight you take. Choose the ratty angles here, and angles where you don't have to take a 50-50 engagement to come out on top. The enemy is pushing into you. Give yourself the advantage. This tip goes hand in hand with basic defaulting. Unrewarded defaulting is a mistake seen a lot with this type of play. Is defaulting and getting a pick, then choosing to not follow up on it. One of the most important aspects to a default is taking advantage of the chaos created with an opening pick. Once you get the first kill as an attacker on the default, it's smart to take space in the area you got the pick. This doesn't mean you have to execute, but you shouldn't allow the enemy team to recover the space where you killed their teammate for free. Now, if you don't execute after the pick, that's okay. Just try your best to not give the defenders back the space that you just worked to take. This is another common problem that I notice with attackers at a lot of ranks. You'll see this the most when attackers play a slow default against an already very passive team. What you'll see is the attacker side waiting for almost an entire minute every single round. Waiting and waiting and waiting, all to find a pick that never comes due to the defender side's passiveness. If you're attacking and you're playing a standard passive default, but the defenders aren't giving you anything, this is a perfect signal that your team needs to make the first move. Make the first move here by taking space in a certain area, forcing the defenders to play and rotate around your team's pace. This type of play is extremely effective against over-passive defenders. Overplaying rounds is a mistake that's way too easy to miss. So our tip to you guys on this is just breathe. Your team may be overthinking things here, so simplify it. You don't have to run VCT strats to win a ranked game all the time. Sometimes simple takes are what'll win you the games. There's no need to fake every single round. Just play the game and figure out the best playstyle to suit your team while playing. Does this ever look like you? If so, maybe you're over-peaking. This happens so much, it's honestly pretty ludicrous here. Sure, just because you're a defender, it doesn't mean you have to exclusively play defense. But if you're consistently peaking middle and dying every round, take a step back and just reset. Play a bit more passive if you keep giving the attackers the man advantage straight away. Now, this also applies when your team already has man advantage. Try not to balance the scales in the favor of the attacker side when your team is already in the advantage for a round. This 100% is a very possible thing, and it's something that should be recognized if your team is losing a lot of rounds. If your team is losing and you guys are playing extremely passive, try mixing it up. On defense, try coordinating with your team to take space in certain regions of the map while playing defense. This can look like countering the enemy team's aggression in certain areas of the map. Now, ideally, you should take the enemy team off guard since you guys were already playing fairly passive. This works in favor of your team, effectively controlling the pace of the game from this point on. Team play is what separates winning versus losing teams in Valorant ranked gameplay. Once you recognize this, it's fairly easy to get the upper hand on most opponents if it's done right. Now, team play shouldn't be scoffed at. Valorant is a team game, so aim and mechanics is only going to get you so far, and it isn't necessarily as important as people make it out to be. Try calling strats for your team, be it an A-take on Ascent or a default while working mid-control. Just use verbal cues, which will in turn get your team to start talking about what they think will work. Now, that goes without saying, you can't win them all. This is a very important statement to remember too. Just understand that no matter what level of skill you're at, sometimes the enemy team is just way better than yours. And that's okay though. If you lose because your team isn't as good, just reset your mentality there. That's a pretty good life lesson, and just make sure your mind's right and in a good spot to queue up again. Now, with that in mind, try to avoid tilt queuing. It's a very real issue players tend to do. It just makes their Valorant experience that much worse. Is tilt queuing really worth it? Think about it here. You lose hundreds of RR and time that could be better spent not losing hundreds of RR and playing Valorant. Well, we'll let you guys decide on that one in the comments below. Sometimes your aim really isn't the issue. It's your positioning. Now, some games you may feel like your aim is off, and that may be the case, but that doesn't mean that aim is exclusively what's losing your fights. More often than not, poor positioning can lead to lost aim duels and failed fights, so position yourself where you have the highest outcome of winning a fight. Earlier, we talked about the importance of team play. Let's briefly talk about monitoring what utility your team has. But first, make sure this is bound to a key. We recommend it to be bound to a key that is used often too. The reason this bind is so important is because racking your team's utility helps you decide what your team can reasonably do at that point in the round. If your team's running very low on smokes and flashes, it may not be the best idea to contest an area of the map with long corridors and ops posted. So keep these things in mind here. Chances are, and not to be rude here, you're not the best player in the world at the agent that you main. There can only be one, so please take a chance to learn more agents. At this point in Valorant, if you've been playing for quite some time, there shouldn't be players that don't know how to play a certain role. And we understand that sometimes that simply is the case. We highly recommend each player diversify their pool of agents so that they're capable of playing someone in each role. Team comp is an important part of the Valorant professional scene, and it can be an important part of rank too. But you can win a game with any team composition. Take the Hairy Cucumbers, for example, a team of one-tricks that successfully wins Radiant games with ease on maps where their agents aren't best suited. Knowing that team composition doesn't always matter is just some important knowledge to stand by here. Sure, team compositions can make the game easier, but it doesn't mean that you'll lose if you have 5 duelists. Sometimes your team is simply better and pulls it off. So don't give up when you see no smokes or initiator on your team. Knowing what utility the enemy has in post-plant is extremely important. Before leaving Seaside Ascent to play post-plant long, take a note of what agents the enemy has. things. The first thing I always do when I leave site to play post-plant is recognize if the enemy team has a controller alive that can smoke off the spike. We see this all the time. Defenders try to retake the site, but they're walking from A site all the way to C site. The enemy knows where you'll most likely be coming from. Speed things up a bit. There's only a few places they have to watch in the first place. Retaking too slow is a huge issue here. Once you get down to the nitty-gritty of it too, you end up wasting 20 seconds of your retake just walking to the spike. Once you give away half your time, you only have so many seconds left until the spike explodes. Make sure you're being quick, but not dumb with the way that you play the round. Now let's take a step back for a second and talk about aim mechanics to improve on. Poor pre-aiming is something we see mainly from the low ranks all the way to Ascendant, and sometimes even Immortal too. Make sure when you're playing, you're always aiming where the opponents will be. Doing this technique ensures that you'll only have to make smaller adjustments in order to get a kill, rather than being surprised by an enemy and having to flick all the way to them. Now on the flip side, we see over-flicking pretty often at the lower ranks. Now I'm going to talk about how to combat that here and run you through the reason that it happens. Generally, over-flicking occurs when you're watching too much tens or too high of a sensitivity. These are the two generalized reasons for over-flicking. Now, if you're consistently over-flicking, just take a chill pill for a second and take your time with your shots. If this doesn't work, you may be due for a sensitivity change. Changing settings is something that plagues the Valorant community. Usually, if you want to get better at something, you have to take the time to get used to it. Muscle memory is key to consistent gameplay. When you're constantly interfering with the development of muscle memory by changing settings, it'll in turn make you more inconsistent of a player. When you find a sensitivity that you're comfortable with, give it a good while before deciding to switch it because you're playing bad one day. Develop that muscle memory so you can easily find the signs that tell you to switch your sensitivity. Another reason for this, players tend to switch their sensitivity and start playing much better. The reason being, when you switch your sensitivity, your mind isn't used to it. Therefore, you're much more focused on your aim and much more focused on proper corrections. This is the reason why when you switch your sensitivity, you'll play better for a few days and then proceed to play worse than you were before you switched. Stretched res does nothing. It's just a placebo. The only thing stretched does in Valorant is stretch out the HUD and lower your resolution. I myself am a CS player that played 5,000 hours of stretched resolution, but it was all for the reason of the stretched player models. In Valorant, it does practically nothing aside scratching an itch CS players have for playing stretched resolution. I myself play native after thousands of hours of CS and 4x3. So stop listening to all these Valorant gurus that act like a stretch is a must-use to rank up. It simply isn't and never will be unless Riot decides to give us true stretched resolution.
While getting kills is certainly fun and exciting, it's not a realistic goal to have in every game. If you're close to the rank you deserve, you won't be able to constantly drop 30 every game. Instead of thinking about trying to get kills, try to focus on the impact you're making in the game. There's more ways to contribute than just fragging out. For example, the purpose of playing duelists is not actually to get kill. Their purpose is actually to create space for the rest of your team to push in. If you're able to throw a smoke and dash into sight to distract the enemy, you've done your job. With the enemy's crosshair mispositioned, the rest of your team can more safely push in. Just like that, you've made your teammates' lives infinitely easier. In most cases, the impact you make is what gets you and your team kills, which is most important. Think about ways you can make an impact with your agent, whether that's blocking off choke points, distracting the enemy, or even something as simple as just staying alive. Moving on to our next tip though, and this is an important one. One way to really think about impact is with team-based play. Many players at low ranks try to charge in by themselves, but this is rarely the correct decision. It's a 5 versus 5 game, not 1 versus 5. By communicating and creating a strategy, you'll find yourself having much more success on kills in your games. For example, you can coordinate where you want smokes thrown during a sight hit, or where you want your team to throw a flash. This will block the enemy's vision and blind nearby players, making it so much easier to push into areas than if you had to push in dry. Speaking of making the game easier, if you want to play well, you likely want to consider lowering your sensitivity. Valorant is all about precision, so a lower sensitivity is going to help you accurately shoot down enemies. Don't just take my word for this though. All you have to do is look at the pros. The sensitivity of the pros ranges from 600 EDPI to as low as 100 EDPI. EDPI is calculated by multiplying your in-game sensitivity by your mouse's DPI. We recommend playing somewhere in the middle of these two values. For example, Wardell from TSM uses 800 DPI and an in-game sensitivity of 0.326. This may seem low for most people, but it's necessary if you want to aim better. This is just one decision you'll have to make if you want to be a better player, but you've got plenty more decisions to make. For example, it's important that you pick a specific role to focus on. You have to keep in mind, the role you pick is partially going to determine your playstyle. If you're on a duelist, you want to be in the front line pushing aggressively. If you're on a sentinel, you'll want to be further in the back and more passive. This way, you survive longer and can heal yourself or your teammates if need be. If you're used to one role and playstyle, then switching over to another role that requires an entirely different style is going to throw off your play. This is why we recommend sticking to one role that you generally prefer. That being said, it's important to have a backup role to fill for. Unfortunately, people are going to insta-lock agents, and sometimes they're going to force you to play a role you're not used to. Right now, everyone wants to play duelists, so if that's your main role, you definitely want a backup plan. You can take any role you like, but we highly suggest controllers as they're usually the ones that end up in the back burner. They're easy to play and probably are one of the most impactful roles in the game. Especially on a map like Breeze, you do not want to skip out a controller or you'll have a very rough time on attacker's side facing 1,000 different angles. Continuing to tip number 6, be sure you're consistently changing up your position during different rounds. If you play the same spot or push the same choke point over and over, the enemy is going to catch on. The most common one we see is pushing through garage on defense every single round. Eventually, the enemy is going to counter you, whether that's with more players or abilities of their own. You don't necessarily have to change the choke point you're holding, but just going into a different spot can make you less predictable and help keep your enemies guessing. Also, remember that every agent has a few tricks to mix things up. For example, Raze has her double satchels that you can do to cover an insane amount of distance and outplay the enemy. Jett also has a few cool combinations, such as this one on Ascent. You can actually updraft and dash over the rooftop on B and get into the site incredibly quick. This is really nice for catching enemies off guard, especially if you have Jett knives available. Over on the website, we hired a bunch of Radiant 1 tricks, and I can tell you firsthand, there are so many things you can do when you've mastered your agent. One of my favorite courses is the Viper course that Swoopy put together. He walks you through some of his best tricks to win more games, and it's helped me a ton with my own play. Definitely recommend checking it out. Speaking of Viper, if you're playing any agent with a Molotov, you're going to want to learn lineups for it. These lineups can be the difference between you winning 2, sometimes even 3 rounds every single game. One of my personal favorites is this Molotov lineup with Brimstone. To perform it, you line yourself up to the vertical line on this back wall. Now aim the left side of the arrow icon on top of the Molotov ability with this corner on pipes. Once that's done, fire away, and you got the default plant spot on A site. These lineups add a ton of stalling power for your team, so it's super important that you add them to your arsenal. On the topic of abilities, it's important to not be completely afraid of them. That doesn't mean that you should run through every ability in the world, but the context matters. In a case where you're fairly certain that the enemy won't see you coming, it can be okay to go through utility. For example, in this clip, Viper just popped her ultimate down B. Knowing that it takes a few seconds for it to fully bloom, the player decides to sneakily push through it as it's forming. This catches the Viper off guard and gives them an incredibly easy kill, and honestly, might have even saved the round. For normal smokes, a flash through them or push while the enemy is planting the spike is another viable scenario. Ask yourself whether the enemy would be prepared or not, and that will typically give you the answer of if it's a good play. Honestly, knowing when to push and when not to push is super important when it comes to improving. Most players have the habit of over-peaking when they shouldn't be, and it ends up getting them killed and losing so many rounds. This most commonly happens after the spike has been planted. If you're on the attacker side and ahead in numbers, then generally you want to be pretty passive. Just hold the angle with your teammates and wait for the enemies to come to you. When you're down in numbers though, generally you want to try to push the initiative and isolate the enemies as best as you can. In this clip, you'll notice the player is in a 1v2 and surrounded by players in Arcade and B main. He has to push one of those points to even the odds before the second player gets to him, otherwise he'll be overwhelmed. Instead, you'll notice he waits in a corner, and just as I said, the round ends in a loss. As a general rule of thumb, remember if you're down in numbers, you need to find a pick to even out the round. But if you're ahead in numbers, you want to prevent them from finding a pick. Leaping into our next tip though, movement is crucial in Valorant, and one of the most crucial moves you need to learn is strafe jumping. Strafe jumping is when you jump towards one direction and then quickly move to the other direction. You perform this by moving your mouse over to the opposite direction mid-jump. This allows you to check an angle for any enemies without exposing yourself to be killed. Particularly, it helps you check if there's any of those meddling operators that are waiting for you to peek into their crosshairs. Trust me, this strafe jump will save you time and time again from getting sniped. Another great way to deal with operators is with good teammates. Solo queue is like RNG. There's really no telling what kind of teammates you're going to run into. The best way to minimize that RNG is by finding players to consistently play with. You have less random players and also have a better idea of the roles and playstyles of your teammate. This will allow you to communicate and coordinate plays a lot more efficiently. We suggest playing with 1 to 2 players if you're really looking to climb. This gives the perfect balance of having teammates you know, but not too many that you end up playing against another pre-made 5-man team. 5-mans can get pretty sweaty, as everyone knows each other and can pull off more team-based plays. It really becomes a team diff at this point. However, if you feel confident in your 5, then go for it. On the topic of teamwork, you should try to make sure you're calling out enemy positions as much as you can. That way, your team can react to it. Don't ever assume your team saw what you saw. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but does it really make sense to risk it? Particularly if you're engaging an enemy and getting eliminated, you want to call out where the enemy was last found so your teammate can immediately trade them. We see all too often when players get killed and don't communicate where the enemy was. As a result, your teammates swing out without a clue what's going on, and the enemy gets another free kill that could have been avoided. Communication is one of the easiest ways to increase the return on plays, and all it takes is a little bit of extra effort. Know what also just takes a little bit of extra effort? Watching the flank. There aren't too many things in Valorant that feel quite as bad as getting shot in the back. It sucks, but it's preventable. If your team's been fiddling around a few areas and left an opening, you want to make sure to check that opening to avoid getting flanked. This is why having sentinels like Cypher, Killjoy, and Chamber are so useful. You have traps or a turret that can watch the flank for you. This way, your team can confidently move forward in other parts of the map without worrying about getting knifed from behind. This just comes down mostly to knowing what each agent does, which brings us to tip number 15. This is particularly for the new players out there, but it's very important that you learn what every ability in the game does. And yes, I mean every single ability. While focusing on your own agents is great to master their abilities, you still want to know what other agents can do. That way, there aren't any surprises that come your way. This particularly pertains to when new agents are released. Everyone and their mother is going to be playing that agent, so you better know what that agent does or else you'll be in for a big surprise. Even better if you know what kinds of tricks each agent can do. An example of this would be those pesky lineups and double satchel plays. There are also shock dart lineups on Sova, and many players on Jett will use a dash updraft combo with her ultimate to get the high ground during a fight. Learning what the agents do is incredibly important to being able to shut them down. Something else important for stopping the enemy team though is learning to form crossfires whenever you're able to. A crossfire is when you and a teammate are holding the same choke point but from opposite angles. By doing this, it guarantees that if a player pushes through that point, they'll at best get 1 kill before getting traded out. There's no way the enemy can flick over to the second player's position unless maybe they're 10s, but then you likely have bigger problems. Now, this next tip is a huge learning curve for many players, but that doesn't make it not important. Every round, you should be checking the scoreboard and see what ultimates the enemy has available or almost has available. By doing this, you can be more prepared for what sort of plays the enemy will make. If you see a Killjoy ultimate, for example, they're probably going to use it right away to push one of the sites. Or if you know Brimstone's ultimate is up, you know that you have to fake the spike plant and then move away to another position. A big one is Sage's ultimate. If she has that up, there's a solid chance she'll try to revive a dead teammate. As such, you want to camp that body so they can't get that res off for free. This is a great way to nullify the effects of the enemy team's ultimate, and in many cases, even use the ultimate to your own benefit. Now, we've only got a few tips left, so listen up. If you really want to improve and climb in Valorant, you need to review your own games. Many players don't realize the mistakes they're making when they're currently playing in the match. It's only when you look back at your gameplay that you realize those errors. We recommend using Outplayed to record your matches. If you have a graphics card from NVIDIA, you could also use Shadowplay. Look through certain rounds that you lost or got eliminated and see what you could have done better. Perhaps you overextended and got picked off, or maybe you had abilities that could have helped out. One thing we recommend as well is reviewing your games with other people. This way you can get a different perspective and further break down areas for improvement. This also makes the process a lot more fun with multiple POVs. On a similar note, it's also important to remember that the quality of your game is way more important than the quantity of games played. When you're in the dumps, most people think that they can get back on track through playing more games. In 99% of these cases, that is not the solution. The more games you play, the easier it's going to be for you to burn out. This leads to both physical and mental fatigue, causing you to perform worse. You don't get ready for a test by pulling all-nighters. Or, at least in most cases you don't. You get a few hours during the day, then you rest and go again another day. This helps to maximize your efficiency and avoid that burnout. More is not always better. Play a few games, but try not to grind out all day and night.
But aim isn't as important as you think. Don't get me wrong, having good aim can be a great asset, but people treat the game, especially when starting out, as if aim is the only important factor. When you're learning the game, you should focus on improving your raw aim, of course. This means doing aim trainers and deathmatch and actively trying to take duels in your matches. But there will be a point where your aim will be good enough, and that point will come sooner than you think. People miss shots. Rather than telling yourself your aim could have been better, try to ask yourself, how could you have made the shots easier to hit? This sort of segues perfectly into the next tip, which is bad teammates can still be perfectly set up. Listen guys, your teammates might be terrible, but I've seen this in practice so many times from our Smurf commentaries on our website, where we have a Radiant level player matched up with bad teammates, and they are able to make these bad teammates look like exceptional players. And they do this by playing off of them and turning their mistakes into an advantage. Basically, the logic here is, if your teammate is going to do something stupid, you yourself can try to make that stupid play less stupid. I play a lot of Omen, for example, so a way that I'll do that is if my teammate is going to wide swing somebody for no reason, I'll be there to blind that target when they actually take the fight. Or another way is if your teammate is just sitting alone in a one and done, try to bait for them, because if you don't, they're just going to get themselves killed. Furthermore, what this means is that if you communicate with your teammates clearly and correctly, you can generally count on them to trade you. Trust me, I've practiced this with my friends who are literally brand new to the game, and if you tell them when you're going to swing and say swing with me, and then count it down, regardless of how good or bad they are as a player, they will generally be able to get a trade. Moving on to the third tip though, and that is that team play is what separates Radiants from Immortals. And obviously the comparison Radiants to Immortals isn't relevant to a lot of people watching this video, and that's not to throw any shade. Everybody starts somewhere, but the thing you need to realize is that you can start working on your team play right now, whatever rank you are. Specifically, what I mean is that Radiant players are constantly aware of what their teammates are doing and how to play off of them. A great way to play off of your teammates as well is by comboing utility. For example, using an Omen blind at the same time your Sova uses his recon, or using a Raze ultimate at the same time your Skye ults. There are a lot of different ways that you can combo utility, but these are things that you'll see pros do all of the time, because one ability alone is generally a lot easier to handle than 2 to 3 abilities being comboed together. If there's anything I've learned from Immortal level lobbies and analyzing pro plays, it's that Immortal players are still too much of solo players. Immortal players are really good at playing solo, but they don't really understand team play all that much, and it holds them back. And that means it's probably holding you back in your rank too. The next tip is actually a little bit relative, but at least in my experience and what I've heard from pros, 10s included, playing less is generally the secret to ranking up more. Now obviously there's a potential to rank up more by playing more, and the best way to get better at the game is by playing the game. But in my experience, the best way to rank up is to play just a few games a day and actually focus during them. Don't tilt, don't rage when you miss shots, and don't get upset with your teammates. Just play a few games and genuinely enjoy them. You'll play better, you'll notice you win more, and when you lose, you won't go on a loss streak because you'll quit playing. Obviously, the counterpart to this is queuing a lot, and hey, if you win every game doing this, yeah, obviously it will be faster. But that's not normally how it's going to go, and that's why if you're looking to climb, I suggest to play less. Tip number 5 has to deal with team comps, and that tip is it's absolutely necessary to have a controller on your team. I don't care if it's Viper, Omen, Brimstone, or Astra, you need to have a controller on your team, otherwise you're going to have a very rough time in the game. Personally, for me, the game's not even fun without a controller. There are just too many angles, and it's incredibly obnoxious to deal with. This isn't just my take though, I've heard this from pro players like Fnatic Boaster as well. You can get away without a Sentinel, you can get away without an Initiator, but if your team doesn't have a controller, it's going to be a rough time, and you should save yourself the trouble and either dodge or lock a controller. And that's actually what brings us to our 6th tip, which is everything else doesn't matter. Hey, if you got a controller, don't lock Sentinel if you don't know how to play Sentinel. Don't lock Initiator if you don't know how to play Initiator. Listen, I'd rather have you lock an agent that you know how to play well, rather than locking an agent that you've never played before because it's good on a map. The only exception to this rule I might say is that Viper is pretty necessary on Breeze and Sage is pretty necessary on Icebox. You can obviously still win without them, but they are both very, very strong on those respective maps, and I do believe without them it does make the game quite a bit more difficult. But hey, if you don't know how to use those agents on those maps, not going to matter all that much. Remember, it's the utility that makes agents different, and if you don't know how to use their utility, they're useless. So don't pick an agent that you don't know how to play for the purpose of filling, unless it's controller. This next one is a bit more difficult to do, but what I've started to realize most recently is that when you're dealing with a team that likes to just full rush everything, the best way to deal with them is to set up crossfires and shoot them down when they're coming in. You will not, and I repeat, will not be able to deal with a 5-man rush solo when they are using utility and barreling down on sight. You need your teammates to help you, and you need to position in a way where you and your teammates can play off of each other. Obviously, throwing down a molly to block the entrance gives your team more time to rotate, and this can be super helpful, but if you're setting up on a site in a way where you're going to be taking a 1v1 duel, you really want to avoid doing this. The way most site defenses work is you'll have one player in a position where they'll take first contact, and then you'll have another player who will peek off of their contact. But if instead you have one player who takes contact solo, and then they die, and then another player who takes contact solo, and then they die, like, what have you accomplished? Set up a crossfire instead with your teammates on site, and stop setting up solo. Play off of your teammates, and you'll get more kills and win more games. Moving on to tip number 8, the topic of crosshair placement is kind of memed up, but the reason it's memed up is because crosshair placement is basically the whole game. At the end of the day, if your crosshair placement was perfect, like many players seem to believe theirs is, you'd win every single one of your 1v1 duels because all you would have to do is click. This is why it's so important to learn when you're starting out, but many lower ranked players kind of just shrug it off and go, yeah. Like, yeah, the reason we say it a lot is because it's a very large part of the game. That's why a lot of a job of a teacher is to find new interesting ways to teach a subject players maybe have already heard about. Because clearly the ways we're teaching it before didn't stick, but maybe this one will. If you're below the rank of Immortal, your crosshair placement probably sucks. Try to work on it a little bit. The 9th tip though is that baiting your teammates is really easy to do. And I don't mean a good type of baiting, I mean the bad type of baiting. Sometimes your headspace is just not in the place it should be, and you don't even realize you're baiting your teammates incredibly hard. Maybe you're sitting there inside of a smoke doing nothing, or maybe you're playing in a position far away when you could be pushing up to help them. Baiting your teammates is really easy to do accidentally, and it takes active attention not to do. Baiting isn't something that you just flip a switch and suddenly you're not doing it. Even the best players have times where their rounds play out and they're like, oh shoot, I accidentally baited the heck out of that guy. It happens, but by acknowledging that it happens, we can try to make it happen less. Always keep an eye on your map and try to think about how you can be helping your teammates during the round, and it will reduce the amount that you accidentally bait them. Speaking of looking at the map though, let's talk about the opposite thing that has gotten us all killed far too much, and that is looking at the map at the worst time and getting killed because of this. One of the ways I've learned to avoid this is if you're holding an angle, rather than looking at the map, try asking your teammates what they're seeing. Hopefully, if you're holding an angle, you can rely on callouts from your teammates just a little bit more, and that way you won't have to glance at the map all the time. Because theoretically, they all have the same information on their map that you do, right? So hopefully, if you ask people what they're seeing, they can say the same exact thing that you will see. This obviously isn't going to always work because sometimes people just won't talk, but in that case, it might be best just to give up the angle and look at the map and then repeat afterwards to save yourself the risk. This next tip is something that's a bit more obvious, but still so many players have a bad habit of this, and that is pushing smokes that they really shouldn't be pushing. We've all been there where we're pushing a smoke thinking, I really shouldn't be pushing this. Like I said, so many players have this bad habit of needing to push every single smoke that they see, and just waiting a little bit for the smoke to dissipate can oftentimes be so much better. You don't need to push every single smoke that you see. It's okay to let a smoke exist and hold it. And what you'll find is, like I said, many players have this bad habit, so if you hold a smoke, oftentimes players will push them and you'll pick up a free kill because of this. Like I said though, there are some times when pushing a smoke is okay, but start thinking about the situations where you don't have to a little bit more, and you'll probably save yourself a number of times. Tip number 12 takes us to probably one of the biggest things I wish I knew, which is communication is one of the harder skills to improve in Valorant. I think this one literally just revolves around getting people out of their comfort zone. So many gamers are incredibly introverted, and trying to get people to communicate effectively in-game can be really hard. That being said, that's why it's so valuable if you can get people who actually know how to communicate well on a team. I wish when I started out in Valorant, I practiced making callouts just a little bit more and actively communicated what my intentions were within the round, because it would have helped me improve a lot faster. This is something I still struggle with today, and it's because communication is very hard, and for many players, it's the thing holding them back. Tip number 13 is another problem that most players have though, which is they probably use counter-strafing wrong. Lots of people know what counter-strafing is, but they don't actively use it within their matches. Instead, what they do is they go, yeah, counter-strafing. And then every time they take an engagement, they will full crouch in the open and get themselves killed. Listen, if you're going to be taking a prolonged engagement in the open, or you're fighting multiple enemies at the same time, you need to be counter-strafing between your shots. Otherwise, you're going to get traded out, or worse, killed before you can even get one. Counter-strafing doesn't actually make you accurate faster in Valorant, so the point of counter-strafing isn't to hit your shots faster. The point of it is to make yourself more difficult to hit. Tip number 14 takes us into something that many players, especially in low elo, struggle with though, and that is relying too much on gimmicks. What is a gimmick though? Well, those are things like wombo combo killjoy setups, cypher setups, sage wall boost, aggressive omen plays, double shock dart lineups, stuff like that. And listen, gimmicks can be really cool, but what you need to understand though is that they're gimmicks for a reason, and you're probably going to peak with them eventually. Whether that peak is gold 3 or that peak is immortal, eventually you're going to run into players that they don't work against, and you're going to have to adapt. This doesn't mean remove those gimmicks from your playbook though, this just means to understand when they will work and when they won't work, and use them sparingly. Lots of players don't have this skill, but when you develop this skill, that's when you'll run into some of the best and most exciting players to watch. That sort of ties into our next tip though, which is to pay attention to pro play. When you watch pro play, it will be a lot more simple to understand what standard play looks like and how you can sort of copy what they do. Now obviously pro play and matchmaking are super different, but you'll start to pick up on basic concepts of things that are good. You'll start to understand how pros play clutch situations, how they use their utility to grab territory, how they play around their teammates really well. People roast the casters in Valorant a lot, but some of them actually do a really excellent job of explaining what players are doing and why they're doing it. When casting, generally there's going to be a play-by-play caster and then a color caster. The color caster's job is to generally provide analysis during the game to give viewers a detailed understanding of why pros might do what they do, and then the play-by-play caster's job is to generally cover the more hype moments and break down the more intense visuals on the screen for the viewer. If you're looking to improve, try to listen to what the color caster is saying during the slower parts of the round to have a good understanding of what is going on in the game. Many of these guys do a really good job of this. Moving on to number 16 though, and we say this a lot on the channel, if you haven't been recording your games yet, you really should. One of the easiest ways to pick out your mistakes in Valorant is to look back through them when you're not playing and think about what you could have done better. Luckily, we recently launched our own community Discord where you can submit your own VODs for us to review, so if you're looking to get your games looked at by us and potentially featured in a video, be sure to check that out, link in the description below. Moving on to tip number 17 though, and that's going to be to try to find players better than you to play with. Maybe you find these guys in your matches who just seem to be really strong players, or maybe you go out of your way to find a community to play with. Generally, if you put yourself out there, you'll be able to find players who are better than you, and that's how you're going to improve faster. Because at the end of the day, playing with people better than you is going to make things more challenging, and things that are more challenging always offer more for you to learn and grow from. What I highly suggest is that, like I said before, if you encounter good players in your matches, add them, and then try to play a few matches with them. You never know who you'll meet along the way. Something else to keep in mind with people in Valorant is tip number 18, which is toxic players will never say anything useful. And this is in reference obviously to players who don't want to mute players because they might make necessary callouts. Remember earlier how I said that you pretty much have all of the information you need on your map? I mean, don't get me wrong, there are some things that you can't get from your map, such as audio or your teammates' intentions, but you can still kind of read your teammates' intentions by just looking at how they're positioned, and you can also still see enemies on the map when they appear. So trust me when I say, somebody who is being an absolute jerk to you is never going to start being like, hey, I'm swinging this corner, can you trade me? Or, I hear 4B, they're in spawn flanking you. This stuff just isn't going to happen. Trust me, I have thousands of hours in this game now. Rather than making helpful callouts, what they're going to do is bait you, and then they'll get upset with you after you die after they bait you. It's not worth it. Just mute these guys and try your best to not only win the game, but enjoy the game. Because you shouldn't be letting some jerk on the internet ruin an experience for you that is supposed to be fun. Moving on to tip number 19 though, and that is you don't need to be a hero to climb. A lot of players have this really warped mentality that they need to hard carry every single game that they're in, but that's just not the truth. You have to play well, don't get me wrong, and I would say that you have to pull your weight, but if you want to climb, you need to do your job and a little bit more. That should be your goal every single game. Don't expect to hard carry, and there are going to be games where you might actually have to hard carry to win. But if you want to climb, matchmaking should do a good job of balancing teams, meaning that all you have to do is pull your weight and a little bit more. Like I said, this won't always be true, but most of the time it will, and this will prevent you from having the whole mentality where it's you versus the world, because it's really not. You have 4 other teammates on your team that are all the same rank as you, so stop trying to act like a hero and just try to do your job. You'll be surprised how much this helps.
The first and most common mistake I see players making is not getting enough info on defense and just sitting in corners hoping an enemy walks into their crosshair. There are a ton of different ways to get info safely, like jump peeking, using a Sova dart or drone, or even a fade haunt. You get the picture here. A lack of information is never a good thing, so use your utility a little more efficiently in order to safely figure out what the other team's game plan is for the round, so you'll be able to communicate for early rotations or even rotate off the site yourself. Now, another mistake players tend to make in the lower ranks is allowing themselves to be isolated with zero trade potential. When pushing site or even on defense, you always want to position yourself in a way so if you lose a fight, you've got a teammate that'll trade you. This ensures you are never at a disadvantage and can be extremely game-changing if you implement it into your gameplay. Try to be aware of where your teammates are positioned. Glance at your minimap every now and then. Communicate with them. Ask them to be ready to trade you if you're ready to take a duel. This next mistake, while it sounds like common sense, somehow it's not. When coaching lower ranked players, I often see them using weapons incorrectly. And what I mean by this is if you're using a specific weapon, you have to have a plan in mind on how to position yourself so you can take a duel that's in your favor. For example, if you have a stinger, would you fight someone B-long on Pearl? Instead, if you had a judge, you may play behind the screen, or even mid-link or art, and it would be far more effective. This goes for all weapons, like the Spectre, Stinger, Shorty, or whatever weapon you're using. Always try to make a plan for how you're going to position yourself to get the most impact possible in the round, regardless of the weapon. This next mistake is for our duelist mains, especially for you, Jet and Neon mains. Since you guys have movement abilities, you will of course end up further ahead of your teammates while entering. But just because you can dash through a smoke doesn't mean your team can do the same. So make sure not to tilt when your teammates don't run through immediately, because not every entry is a good one. Since you're the entry, it's your job to figure out if it's a good idea to go in or not. If you lead your team into a 3v5 where they have to run through a molly and are getting tagged by a silver recon on the other side, they might not be as eager to follow you in the future. Assess the situation, and sometimes rotating might be the correct decision. Now let's talk about crouching. There's a big myth that crouching is bad, but in fact, it can be very useful. However, the mistake that low elo players tend to make is instant crouching. The problem with instant crouching is it commits you to a fight, and it makes you an easier target. The only time you should be crouching is if it's an isolated 1v1 fight or if you're fighting someone who's strafing. For example, if you're peeking out of hookah on bind towards market, you see two enemies holding the angle. Crouching is the absolute worst thing you could do. Instead, you should go for a shot and attempt to fall back. Or if you're holding an angle and the enemy wide swings it, crouching makes you a stationary target while the enemy's a moving one, and this puts the fight in their favor. Understanding when to crouch and when not to crouch is what most players struggle with. So if you can understand when it's best to crouch, it's going to put you ahead of other players in your rank. Another big mistake I constantly see is players quickly switching to melee. Often, it's going to get people killed. They're not ready to take a fight, and realistically, it does nothing for you. In fact, your movement velocity is the exact same speed if you're shift walking with your melee out or if you have a rifle out. So it really doesn't do anything except make it so you're not able to react if you see an enemy. And I know, it's a tough habit to break, but trust us on this one. We promise. I also tend to see people play whatever agent the team needs, but in my opinion, this is actually counterproductive. Playing an agent you're uncomfortable with can lead to poor performance, and also lead to tilting, which is a huge mistake. Personally, I suggest never filling and only playing with a few agents you can master. Watch guides, practice them in game. It makes it so you never have to think about how to use your utility because it's just second nature at that point. Being comfortable, it allows you to not have to second guess yourself and leads you to having more confidence, and confidence is key. For our next mistake. This one's for my controller mains. Smokes are often thrown wrong, even in immortal lobbies. The entire point of a smoke is to block a line of sight for an enemy while also making it so if they push through it, they'll be punished. But I still constantly see players throwing smokes way too deep and then giving free space to lurk out through the smoke and catch their team off guard. Instead, you want to place your smoke right at the choke point. So if anyone attempts to push through, they'll be instantly punished. For our next mistake, it's the most common one I see at almost any rank. When in a post-plant situation, there's almost no reason to take a fight when you have an advantage. But for some reason, players get a little bit too kill hungry and overextend, and then they throw the round. Now, there are a few different ways that you can secure a post-plant. The first, most obvious ones, using things like a Sova ultimate, Brimstone ultimate, or Molly lineups. But you can also set up a crossfire with a teammate. So when the enemy team attempts to retake, they end up sandwiched between the two of you, and they have no chance not to be traded. People also commonly fail to understand how angle advantage works. And what I mean by this is if you're closer to an angle than the enemy, they're going to see you first. In fact, there are even certain angles where you can't see an enemy at all, and they're able to see you. So when you're getting ready to peek someone, make sure to position yourself as far away from the angle as possible, so you don't end up getting punished by this. This also works in a slightly different way. The closer you are to an angle, the faster an enemy will appear to be moving. Even though they're moving at the exact same speed, no matter the distance, they will appear faster because their perceived motion will be slower the further away they are in your field of view. Our next mistake we're talking about would be players half clearing angles. Commonly, when players will check a corner or an angle where a player could be, they don't actually commit to clearing it and instantly turn away and get punished. When it comes to clearing angles and understanding them, you need to commit to clearing the angle fully while trying to make an effort to not expose yourself to other angles as best as possible. Especially if you're the first person entering the site, it's your job to clear the close angles. If you don't, an enemy could very easily show some slight trigger discipline and end up getting multiple kills on you and your teammates who now think it's clear. Speaking of which, I see a lot of players using their jet clash incorrectly when entering onto a site. Most of them think just dashing into a smoke is the best way to entry. But for example, on Ascent, if you were to dash towards Switch while dashing, you should be moving your mouse left and right. It allows you to clear close angles while you're mid-dash, making you a harder target to hit while also giving your team valuable info. This one's an easy fix, but I tend to notice quite a few players trying to find the perfect opportunity to use their ultimate, and it never comes, so they just end up not using it at all. Since your ultimate will only gain points when you don't already have it, it's usually best on most agents to just use it as soon as possible, and then you can start working towards it again in the same half. So once you get your ultimate, make a game plan on how you're going to use it. For example, if you have a Viper ultimate, tell your team you're going to Viper ult that round. On defense, this could free up teammates to cover other positions, and on offense, it could let them know that their win condition is getting you on site. It's a simple but incredibly effective way to create a game plan and get your team on the same page. Now, this mistake is probably one of the most common ones in lower elos, and it involves movement. Many players shift peek angles because they don't want to make a noise while peeking. But you can actually silently peek an angle while strafing without holding your walk key. There's a slight dead zone that all you high elo players abuse to strafe while being silent. We call this the two-step method. If your strafe is under 2 steps, you'll be completely silent while being a much harder target to hit than a walking one. This one's gonna take some practice until you fully understand how much you can strafe while silent. So load up a custom game and try this one out for yourself. Another big mistake I see players make is what people refer to as COD reloading, which is when players reload their weapon when they still have more than enough ammo left in their clip. You know what? Even I'm guilty of this. This often gets people killed because while you're reloading, enemies might be looking for a trade on the kill you just got. It is incredibly important to not reload unless you're certain that you're safe or unless you absolutely need to. And when reloading, you should also be incredibly afraid of enemies hunting you down. Good players will try to take this opportunity to close the gap on you. Another crucial mistake I see players making is being very one-dimensional, and this can affect every agent role. For example, if you're using the same Cypher setup or Killjoy setup every single round, any smart enemy will know exactly how to counter it. The same way that if you try to play Molly lineups every round, any smart enemy would know that they need to retake faster to counter you. I frequently see players get punished for making the same play multiple times over and over and then continue to make that same play they were punished for. This is a huge problem, because if the enemy adapts to the plays you're making and you have a one-dimensional playstyle, you're not going to be able to change it up efficiently and can easily lose your team the game. It's also good to be able to identify your opponent's tendencies, so you can abuse players that are constantly making repetitive plays and gain an advantage for your team instead. Let's talk about dry peeking. This is a key mistake that many low-ranked players struggle with, especially against an AWPer. Dry peeking is a term we use to describe peeking an angle without the use of any ability. Especially if an enemy has an AWP, whether you think you're better than them or not, the best way to deal with them is to use utility to either flash them or drone them to see if it's safe first. You always want to give yourself the best opportunity to get a frag, and it's harder for an enemy to hit you. Most players are going to die with utility every round anyway, so it's a lot better to be safe than sorry. This next mistake is one of the most common ones I see in low elo, walling mid on Sage at the very start of the round. This wall gets instantly broken and has close to no value in the round, and the whole point of Sage wall is to stop people from being able to rotate through mid or ropes, so why would you burn it in the first 2 seconds of the round? Instead, wall at the top of mail and watch the cross to ropes from on top of your wall. This makes it so people can't lurk up mail on a B push, and you also still have all the information on whether someone crossed towards rope or not. If the mid wall's getting broken every round, there's a much better way to adapt in your games and still get value from your 400 credit ability. Another very common mistake I see is when players get stalled by enemy utility at a choke point and they just stare at a smoke. And the problem with this is if you wait, it allows the enemy team to rotate, and then you're forced to push a stacked site. When the enemy team attempts to delay your push with utility, you've got three options. Either you push through it, you try to beat the rotates, or you rotate yourself. You can also fake a rotation and try to make the enemy team rotate back, but you need to communicate this with your team so they don't just stick around making noise, and the fake rotate might actually work. Speaking of rotations, a mistake that is way too common is over-rotating. I know sometimes we hear our teammates communicate to us that it's A or it's B after hearing one person, but knowing when to rotate is important so you don't give the enemy team a free bomb site. This is where paying attention to your minimap comes in handy. If you spot 4 to 5 enemies on your minimap, it's safe to assume it's a good rotate. But on certain maps like Bind, where the enemies can teleport and rotate faster, it's typically good for at least one player to anchor the site. The surefire way to know if you should rotate is if you have control of the enemy spike. Anytime your team has control of it, you should be rotating to stack that area of the map since they need to get it back to win the round. Make sure to be mindful of whether or not they have an Omen ultimate though, because they may use that ultimate to grab the spike and rotate.
Alright though guys, before we wrap this up, let me tell you a little bit more about SkillCapped. So we offer a 5-division rank up guarantee, and we think that's a pretty crazy thing to offer. It's like a gym membership guaranteeing that you'll get ripped. Your local gym would go bust if they offered you that. Not us though. We offered this for years because our service really does work. It works so well in fact that we are able to produce by far the largest catalog of premium Valorant guides on the internet. We add new courses every month. With over 1,000 Valorant guides curated into over 50 courses, no one can compare. We also have a direct line of communication with subscribers in our Discord so that you can get connected immediately to some of the best players in the game who will respond to all of your questions asked. Sign up today for as little as $6.99 a month if you are serious about improving. So that's going to be all for this one today. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.